Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Spotlight. It's been a very dense and actually pretty exciting weekend of sport. Maybe not some events, but many of them were. We watched them all, and I'm sure many of you did also. And when it's all happening in the sports world, it means that discourse is particularly busy. That's our VIP community, where you join by making a small monthly pledge on Patreon, and you can do that in the link in the show notes. And then that gets you access to that community where people were chatting about all the things that we're about to discuss on the show and more. Now, obviously, we're not just a news show telling you what happened. We also try and offer some insights. And so we've taken some of your opinions, some of the articles that you've shared with us over on Discourse, some other things we've seen in the news, and we are going to basically spend the next hour or so of the show discussing some of those. It means we're going to cover, I'm probably going to forget some. We've got some cycling again, just a last couple of words on the Rwanda World Champs. Women's rugby, of course, the World Cup final was played. There's a few doping stories that I think are pretty interesting and have some interesting implications for anti-doping. So let's dive straight into all of that, and we begin, as we always do, with our Discourse Digest. Most of today's show is a digest feature where we whip around the world and pick up on some of the news. And joining me to do that, as always, is Gareth Davies.
Yeah, morning. You missed the one I'm going to start off on, because I thought we'd have a look at the news as it happened over the weekend of our sporting watching. And it started for me early on Saturday morning, because it kicked off with the AFL Grand Final, Australian football, between Brisbane and Geelong. And Brisbane won fairly easily in that. But AFL players, and I know I've had a few conversations with Josh over on Discourse about this, they always impress me with their physiques and fitness levels. I don't know, have you seen much AFL?
Yeah, occasionally, obviously not a huge amount, time zone-wise, and I think it's one of the few sports that is not shown on South African television really at all. There might be one or two matches a week, so I'll forgive myself for forgetting it in the introduction. But I will say that in sports sciences, AFL was world leading for a very long time, and maybe still are, and part of it was the physical conditioning. Many of the sports scientists who worked in those AFL teams eventually migrated and found their way into football teams in England and so on, because they had so much expertise in conditioning players. They were world leading for a very long time.
Yeah, right. But Josh sent me this article, and it's about what AFL players need to sort of survive and thrive in the AFL. But also how the physical profile of the typical player has changed, because historically players were often short and stocky. It says here they had the average height of around 180 centimetres in the 1940s, up to 184 centimetres in the 1990s. And now there's been a noticeable shift towards taller, leaner players. The average modern day player is edging close to 190 centimetres. And some key players are exceeding 200 centimetres, so they're getting taller. And so it got me thinking about how the players have changed over time, and are the players adapting to fit the game, or is the game changing to fit adapting to fit the players? Because the total number of distance the athletes is traveling has increased. They're accelerating more often. They're spending more time running at faster speeds. So is the free-flowing game, the game is becoming more free-flowing, is that because the players can do this, or are players now developing because of that? And we see this also in rugby, don't we?
Yeah, we do. I remember doing an analysis, and this is really basic stuff, just height and mass of World Cup players. I need to actually update that. It was last done at the end of the 2019 World Cup. So it would be interesting to see particularly where the women's game is. But the same thing was happening in rugby, because when rugby went professional in 1995, you can imagine the capacity of the players to spend more time training with better support improved enormously. Plus competition for places went up. And so size accelerated rapidly. You know, like if you compare the teams that won and competed in the World Cups in 1987 and 1991 to what you saw in 1999. I mean, they were different humans. And then what was interesting is that continued to increase until 2007, and then it plateaus, and there's a limit to which the players can increase their size, because the game demands constrain that. And Actually, in 2019, it had come down for the first time. Players had to be, were not had to be, that's my interpretation. Players were smaller than they had been in any previous World Cup. And when we wrote that paper, we actually got some coaches. Stuart Lancaster was one of them. The England women's coach at the time was another. And their insight was that the game had evolved to the point where now you had these very long activity cycles. Like the average activity cycle in rugby was something like 13 seconds. It's now 35, 40 seconds. So the players have to be conditioned more for endurance. They cover more distance, and they have to do more of those in a game because ball and play has gone up. So the coach argument was that the players had to adapt to the way the game was played. And I think, in answer to your question, it's the same thing. In architecture, there's that term form follows function. I think you see that in biology and physiology as well. Some coach somewhere in the AFL has worked out that if I play high tempo, minimal rest, cover more distance, force the opponent to cover more distance, there's a competitive advantage. And then that drives the way that you have to condition the player for the demand. That's how I think it would work, in that order.
So it's like the first adopters get the early advantage. So you start playing that system and you've already brought the players in that can do it, sort of thing. But then, of course, everybody plays catch up. And
I think so.
Is it a bit of an arms war, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. It would be interesting. I don't know enough about AFL to even begin to speculate, but I would ask the question, at some point in that evolution, somewhere there will be a successful coach who had a particular style of play, and they began to drive innovation around tactical, strategic setup of players on the field, and then that in turn dictates the game demands. And if they are successful, then everyone else slowly will start imitating, because you're analyzing your opponents, you're seeing what it is that they do. And it'll be the same in football. I would not be surprised if Guardiola's style of play, the high possession, high fast passing game with a press, has evolved and changed the way every other team plays, and then out of necessity the player has to be conditioned differently to do that. Now where it gets interesting, I think, is like in rugby, there's more than one way to win. So maybe that doesn't happen at quite the same rate. I don't know, maybe AFL is the same. But if there's a more effective way to play in order to win, someone will find it, and then everyone else will imitate it, and then every player has to evolve to look that way, or be conditioned to play that way.
Of course, everything's accelerating, because the first data I mentioned, I think, was the 1940s, and they were talking about shorter, stockier players. But of course, professionalism is going to have a massive impact on the way that players are trained and conditioned. Because you don't see players we used to talk about like the 1970s in football, and the players would have a big cooked breakfast, go to training, and then go to the pub all afternoon, and they'd all be smoking fags all day. And that's not, that's obviously not how professionals act these days. But also data, because the boom in data now, because you wouldn't have seen, the amount of data back in the 90s or the early 2000s. Nowadays, there's so many stats, and I think sometimes players are in danger of almost being overlooked, or skills are being overlooked just on the fitness stats.
Yeah,
Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, that definitely happened. If you think about where that data's come from and how that's evolved, in the early 2000s, GPS units became available for the first time, and then would have been really widespread. And that's where I think AFL probably were a first mover in that space. And so now coaches were tracking how many meters did you run, how many meters did you walk, what was the ratio of your walking to your running distances and time, and that sort of stuff. And I reckon, and we've spoken about this exact issue in the past, Goodhart's Law, and a lot of people say, well, we can measure it, so now it's going to become the targets, and then it gets misused and misapplied. I know of rugby coaches who were making substitutions because players reached the so-called or perceived ceiling of their distance. The players run 6.3 Ks, get him off. Well, no, he's playing out of his skin. He's the best player on the field, and he's not tired, so why would you do that? So I think that mistake was made. But at the same time, it is going to also have positive implications, because let's say the evolution in the game is faster tempo, increase in the number of sprints in a game by 15%. That means less recovery time between those sprints. So the coaches are looking at that and saying, well, our training sessions don't simulate the match demands, so therefore we have to change the way we train in order to prepare for what's going to happen on a Saturday, Sunday. And then all of a sudden everything's evolved, and now every player is training differently.
Well, the next event, well, I watch things in between, but the Women's Rugby World Cup final. And actually, before we actually go into the final itself, that's made me think, is women's rugby perhaps, as we're seeing a sport develop almost from the beginning? I know it's been around a while, but we really are seeing the explosion of it now. Is it almost like a perfect petri dish to watch how these changes to players happen in real time? Do you think we're going to see the women's physiques change in rugby?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really cool thing to look at and track. And actually, back in 2018-19, when I wanted to do that analysis, because I had access to this World Rugby database of all the players' heights and weights, that was one of the most interesting things to look at. Is in men, you went through amateur, accelerated professionalism, and then this almost stabilization, and I wouldn't call it regression, but it's like trending back down again. It's never going to go back to the early 1990s, obviously. But then the really interesting question is that women's rugby in its life cycle is now where men's rugby was in 1996, I would say.
Mm.
Like maybe that's slightly inaccurate, but you know what I mean. But the difference is that women have also got the opportunity to capitalize on 20 years, 25 years worth of, call it institutional wisdom from the broader game. So I think you'll see accelerated change in the women's game compared even to the men's game. But this is where, and we're not going to harp on this because we'll talk more about the positive side of that final. This is where that threat comes, because who are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of that institutional wisdom and the opportunity to invest it in professional players are going to be the haves, the countries and the unions that have already got that in place. And so there's the real risk, I think, of hyper acceleration for some and stagnation for others that will widen that gap. So as long as that's avoided, I think the women's game is evolving more rapidly than anything we've seen in a long time.
Well, obviously, England did win that Rugby World Cup, beating Canada in the final, quite convincingly, I think, in the end. But wouldn't it be fair to say that England perhaps are already nearing the top of the peak at the moment of the professional game? They've already had the advantage, so
Yeah,
there's a bigger advantage to be gained from those coming up,
exactly. And
proportionally.
that's why, and in the end, okay, the scoreboard was a 20-point win, right? Which is a big win. But it was one of the closer one-sided games you'll ever see.
Mm.
And unlike the golf, which was a very close hiding. um, so we'll get to that. But it was I think going into this, remember, England had been the dominant force all the way from the 2017 World Cup up to the COVID break, and then 22 World Cup
Oh,
in New
yeah.
Zealand, and were again the dominant force. So it would have been a major surprise to not win their home tournament, given the infrastructure and the resources and the head start they've got on everyone professionally. They are so far ahead in terms of putting in place professional contracts, support systems around those players, scouting, talent ID, feeder systems. They really are like so in the end it's a deserved win just for the sake of the investment in the system that they've made that no one else has been able to match. But they
Mm.
are way ahead. Whether that means that they're at the top, I don't know.
Well, not the top, but nearing the peak. And
They
so
have
obviously anything they do now is going to be slightly diminishing returns compared to the other.
exactly. They have to be. They have to be closer to the peak. And it's interesting to speculate. Like, what would the England team of 2025 do to the All Blacks team of 2017? And I think they would put 40 on them, because that's
Mm.
how quickly the game's evolving. But the England team of 2033 shouldn't be able to put 40 on the England team of 2025. They'll only be 5 points better. Whereas you have to think Canada can continue to improve. France have got an elite competition. New Zealand have had for a while the Farah Palmer Cup, as it was known. Um, Australia is making and this is where I'm encouraged, is that the next World Cup's in Oz in 29, and that means as hosts they'll invest. We've seen
Yeah.
South Africa making investments. The Six Nations are. So it feels to me that the game is accelerating, and I hope that by then it is. There are 6 teams who could go into it with not
Yep.
necessarily a reasonable chance of winning, but certainly of making semi-finals.
I'll tell you, it's accelerating around where I live because I went to watch the rugby in the pub on Saturday afternoon in my local, and I walked in just as the match was starting, and everybody was watching the the Women's World Cup final. And I'd fully be expecting them because terrible timing by whoever organises rugby matches. Argentina were playing South Africa at pretty much the same time. And I was fully expecting to see the men's rugby on the TV because I walked into a bar with a dozen men in it.
Yeah.
And that's normally the first thing they'd be turn over. We're going to watch the men's game,
Yeah,
and they sat there glued to the women's game. And it was only when it started to become obvious that England were going to win, people started thinking, "Oh, let's just go and see what's happening in the other game." So
well,
that's a big change. It
yeah,
really is.
well, here in Girona, there's an Irish pub, and the Women's World Cup final was their headline sports event on Saturday afternoon. You know how in the pubs they'll put on a big chalkboard what's coming up
Yeah.
live. Saturday afternoon, Women's World Cup final, 5 p.m. It was actually the headline piece. And then, like later on, Premiership games and so on started to take over. No sign of South Africa, Argentina. So that's progress for sure. And it was a good final actually. Like I know the scoreline in the end was one-sided, and there was no suspense. We said last week that we really hoped it was 20 minutes to play. It was a one-score game. It didn't happen, but I don't think it was a letdown because Canada scored first. I think the most impressive thing by England actually was their composure in response to that, because having lost the previous World Cup as favourites, and now at home with even more pressure and more expectation, to concede early and then still pull yourself back and win it fairly convincingly, I thought that showed a lot of character. I will also say Canada looked lacking in composure to me compared to certainly the New Zealand game. They seemed a bit frantic, forcing things, but maybe that was also partly England's speed and just the pressure England because they wouldn't have seen anything like it in the tournament from anyone they played. So in the end, it's hard to argue, And I just one word on England. I went back and looked because in the commentary they spoke about the fact that they had not lost a game since that previous World Cup final, and they gave I think the wrong number. I've counted 33 matches. The Canada win at the weekend was their 33rd consecutive match win. And in that sequence of 33 games, they've scored over 50 11 times, so that's every third match. They've won by 50 or more 9 times, so that's more than 1 in 4. And they've only won by a score or less twice. And that was 2 matches against France. One where they won by 5 points, and then another one in 2025, earlier this year, where they won by 1 point. So their average score over the last 4 years is 50, and the opposition score is 12. So it's extraordinary dominance. And look, I hope that gap is closed because I don't want to see another World Cup where a team goes into it with that level of basically invincibility.
Yeah, somebody said to me, "Oh, did Canada choke because of all the mistakes?" And I thought, no, they didn't choke. They were choked because England just were by far the better team in the end of the day, just a bit more clinical. I know you were getting a little bit frustrated by some of the Canadian lack of penetration, things like that. And I've got some statistics on that. I'm not a great fan of statistics like this in the main, but it's quite interesting. This is on the women's official site. There's a statistic they now called 22 entries, and they've called it rugby's version of shots on goal. And it's how often you score when you actually get into the 22 in a meaningful manner, not just booting the ball straight through. Canada entered England's 22 more often, 10 to 9 times, but they only got 1.3 points per entry compared to 3.7 for England. So that shows that England were far more clinical when they got down there. They were just scoring when they got there. And we could see that. Canada were camped on the line for quite a while, but didn't seem to just have the nous to just get over the line. And that's what I think was frustrating because they scored 3.4 points in the 22 against New Zealand. But again, that's England's defence, perhaps, rather than Canada's failings.
Yeah, a little bit of both. I thought Canada's, like, the closer they got to the try line, the less composed they seemed. It seemed that a lot of those backline moves, those really slick, polished moves that they were running, needed space, and they didn't really have options on those when they were only 5 meters away from the try line. Some of the passing, I thought, after their starting scrum off went off, was a little bit ponderous. Very sort of looping passes. England's line speed was basically hitting the receiver as they caught the ball. So that wasn't good. But I noticed that same stat they showed in the game, that same figure, 22 entries and points per 22, and it was vastly different and best typified. There was a period in the second half when England were down to 14 because of that yellow card, and it was 26-13. And Canada, it felt like we're on the England line for 15 minutes. It was probably only 5 minutes because of all the stoppages. But It was just non-stop pressure, and then all of a sudden England won a penalty, I think at a scrum or a ruck, and about 35 seconds later it scored, and then it was 33-13, game was over. So, a score there for Canada, then it's a different game, and so that's why I say it was a close one-sided game in the end.
Yeah.
But I think it does establish, and when you consider those stats, the 50-12 average margin for England in the last 4 years, you've got a very clear number one, a very clear two, then 3 and 4 France, New Zealand, and then a very big gap to 4. And I think the real hope is that in the next 4 years, that situation gets mixed up a little bit.
Yeah, there's been some great conversation about it over on Discourse. Thanks to everybody who's joined in on that. Philip and especially Donald, who made a great point I wanted to read out here about how perhaps women's rugby might develop, because he's a rugby coach himself. He said in the girls' game, and he's saying girls now as in he coaches, I think, youth games, so it's not women's game. There are far fewer close games, so kicking is a less relevant factor because the discussion was all about how often they kick in the women's game, and it's not as often at the moment. But the goal is to score, he says, not to set up field position to score later. And that all then snowballs. You don't kick because you don't need to, so you don't practice, so it's a less valuable option, so you don't kick. And then he says, as the women's game continues to develop, kicking will become a far more relevant part as it is in the men's game now. When women's games are regularly being decided by a single score and one passage of overplaying in your own half costs you the game, kicking will come. Pressure on the kicker will come and the caterpillar ruck will come. The men aren't playing boring rugby because they lack attacking will, but because the defence has progressed to be just as good as their attack, and playing in the wrong areas and moments can cost them the game in a way that currently doesn't in the women's. I think that's a really good point. And John Dobson said the same thing. You can't take risks when the games become much more tight. So it's easy to see free-flowing games in women's rugby at the moment, but things are going to tighten up as we move on and players learn to adapt.
Yeah, they will. And also, as coaching becomes more professional and players are available to train more and they become tactically better trained, defensive systems will get much better. And then it becomes more difficult to break through them with the ball. And so I remember once in a meeting, Steve Hansen, who was the New Zealand coach back when they won the World Cup, I want to say in 2015, if memory serves me, I've got my dates right. He would often say, a kick is a solution to a problem. So what's the problem? The problem is I couldn't go anywhere with the ball, so I had to kick it. That's how I solved the issue, the problem of territory and risk. And that's going to happen eventually for the women's game. So it's in a place at the moment when it doesn't need to, but eventually the problem will emerge. Defenses will be better, and then they'll have to solve that problem with kicking. I still have to slide it in.
It's a bit of a shame, really.
Yeah, it is a little bit. I still think, I hope that a smaller ball improves the passing enough to keep that alive for longer, and it doesn't make it more viable to kick the ball. That's the big risk. Yeah, I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, we'll see.
They'll go because it's going to be used in sevens, and then once it's in there, it'll be in 20s, and so it's coming.
All right. Yeah, we'll wrap up then. That's been a great tournament. The organisers are absolutely over the moon with the attendance and the engagement. I walked into a classroom early on Monday morning, and they were showing footage of the final, I think, through BBC's news round to the kids. And these players, especially the England players, Kilden and that, they've become sort of personalities. And I know that women's rugby want World Rugby's men to take a lead and say, look, you need personalities in the sport, not just these sort of bland individuals who are only focused on winning. So I think a lot has been taken out of the tournament, and so hats off to the organisers there.
Yeah, and I hope that momentum continues. Just speaking of Women's World Cups, the Women's Cricket World Cup started yesterday in India. Game 1 yesterday was played by India and Sri Lanka. I don't know if you registered that. And I hadn't noticed it until I saw it yesterday. And then I thought, well, I wonder if women's cricket is on the same growth pattern and path that women's rugby is, and if not, why?
I did sort of register it, but it's the 50 over World Cup, isn't it? Yeah. It's 50 over cricket's dead.
Yeah, it does. It is a little bit hard to get excited about it.
Yeah. So well, that's a bit of a statement, but it's just 2020 seems to have taken over, and 50 overs just seems to take too long. And so I don't think it's been marketed very well. I've just seen little snippets about it, but
not to us anyway. But I've sometimes felt like I've lost touch with cricket. I feel like I would have known everything happening in the world. South Africa was in England the other day playing in Leeds, and I was literally sitting in my mate Ben's office, and I heard cheers. I said, what's going on there? And it turns out the cricket stadium was right next door. South Africa was playing them, and I didn't even know it. So that's how detached I am.
Yeah. Perhaps that's the fault of T20 cricket. It's just like too much filler. You eat too much poor quality cake, you're just going to get sick of cake.
Yeah, and why would you do the thing in the middle? Makes no sense. They did cannibalize it, I think, a little bit. Anyway, I just remember that there's another Women's World Cup that kicks off no sooner than the previous one had ended, albeit in a different sport. So
no, that's global sport. It's never ending. Keeps us in podcasts. Speaking of which, podcasts, we've got the World Championships cycling was the next step in the afternoon. With the women's race on Saturday and then the men's race on Sunday. I put the title down here as World Championship Yawn Fest, and I was referring mainly to the men's race there because it was exciting until it wasn't, and it wasn't really exciting. It had that one brief burst of entertainment when Pogacar and only Ayuso could steer his wheel, so a little bit of intrigue because they're no longer teammates on UAE, and then it was just a procession. There was no intrigue. I mean, if the most intrigue is Remco having to change his bike 2 times and kicking a bottle over, then you can count me out, and I gave up and walked the dog.
Yeah, I pretty much did the same when you messaged me to say, oh, here we go again, solo attack, 100k gap already. That's like, there goes my Sunday afternoon watch. And it's not the first time, right? Cycling has become this. And I know we're supposed to be grateful for watching like the greatest ever, but I don't know, I find myself underwhelmed.
And
for a few reasons, of course. And Mike and I spoke a little bit about the course and so on. But I think if you go back, you had the Strade Bianche long range attack 80k, Van der Poel won Roubaix, not this year, but the year before. We've seen so many of these like this, and you're watching something exceptional, but it's unbelievable. But I don't know, I want to see races, and that's why the junior races in Rwanda were much more entertaining to me. The women's race the day before was interesting. This one was not.
I'm not sure what they can do because people have said, oh, the course was too hard, or the course was this and the course was that. I'm not a great fan of looped finishes anyway, as in the women's race, that's all it was. But I understand why they do it for the spectators. But if you pick a flat course, everybody will say, oh, it's just the sprinters can win. And if you pick a hilly course, it's just the climbers can win. You can't win the UCI on this one.
Yeah, I said to Mike in our Rwanda recap that I think you want a course that invites some tactical opportunities. The way that this one and last year's was similar, maybe not quite as extreme, they just become watt tests. Like it's a 2-minute watt dump 3 times. It's 2 minutes to get away. It's 2 minutes to drop Del Toro, although they actually didn't even need to do anything because Del Toro just couldn't hold the wheel. And then it's 2 minutes for Remco Evenepoel to drop Healy and co and move away to win silvers. And it's because, I don't know, there's just no tactical opportunities to play around and send a teammate up the road. And there seems to me to not be creativity in the race, it's just, and maybe some will say, you want to find the best one-day guy, that's what you're looking for, but it's not intriguing in the same way that if you think about the Tour de France, the big mountain stages obviously determine the race, but I think the most interesting days are those medium mountain days where there's like 5 or 6 different things can happen and you'd be a fool to guess. That's what I want to watch.
I wonder if the lack of race radios played a big difference. I'm not sure if it did in the women's, because again in the women's it frustrated me a little bit like the Olympics, that all the favourites just basically cancelled each other out by refusing to work for each other, and not happy, but they just let somebody else win at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's one of the most frustrating things about cycling is I think irrational decision making.
Because obviously it's done with countries. Everybody's with their countries, not their usual teammates, so it's going to be more difficult to communicate anyway. And then put lack of race radios on top of that, and it's going to be confusion and people not sure what to do. I'm not sure if it works, the lack of race radios there.
Yeah, although, like you say, in the women's race, the split was made from the big group. So 6 women, just maybe it was more than that at the time. It ended up being 6, just sort of drifted off the front. And I think the big favourites looked at each other and said, well, there's an Italian jersey off there. There's a Dutch jersey. We're not going to do anything. You do it. And then no one did it. So it was, It was a strange race, that one. In the end, though, I mean, like Magdalene Valliers, who won that women's race, had only ever won one other race in her life, I think, and it wasn't a World Tour race. So I was trying to think what the equivalent would be in the men's race of someone winning their first race ever as a World Championship. It was astonishing. The odds on that happening must have been astronomically high.
Oh God, if you backed her beforehand, it's a little bit
No.
like the World Championships. Surprises everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. It was like that. Not so much on the men's side. And then on the junior side, I thought the racing was pretty good. The under-18 race was won by Brits. French woman worked really well to win the under-23 race. In the end, didn't get 1 and 2, or even 1 and 3, actually. I think they got 1 and 4 because the woman who did the lead-out for the eventual winner, whose name I now forget, apologies, ended up blowing at the end and ending fourth. So I felt pretty sad for her. And then on the men's side, that Italian who won the under-18s last year won the under-23s this year. So that's a really impressive performance. Lorenzo Finn, certainly a name to watch. There seem to be some pretty good juniors coming through. There's a Belgian kid called Jano Vida, who they say is the next Evenepoel, who was, of course, the next Merckx. So we'll see what happens to him. But he didn't perform in Rwanda. He was the favourite before. But anyway, good juniors. I thought the junior racing was better than the adults.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there was a couple of other things going on in cycling. The UCI have made a little bit of a U-turn on. Remember the handlebars that they said everybody was going to have
Yeah.
wider handlebars?
Yeah,
I think it was 40 mil. Well, they're still going to keep the 400 mil. Sorry,
centimetre.
that'd be ridiculous. 40 mil. They're going to keep the 400 mil limit, but they're going to change the hood-to-hood measurement. And it's now going to be 280 mil rather than 300. All these figures just don't sound like very much of a change to me. But what difference is it going to make to speed of the peloton? I just don't get it.
And even if it did, is that the thing that's causing the crashing?
Well, probably not, because they're looking at trialing a gear ratio, aren't they?
Yeah.
It feels like the UCI are trying to tweak these small things that aren't going to make much difference.
Yeah,
to
a little
solve
bit.
a problem which is far, far bigger. And it keeps going around and around and around. We keep talking about it because they keep doing it.
I mean, on the gear ratio side of things, they've got lawsuits coming their way from the manufacturers. On the handlebar, I remember when they announced that from the first instance, there was an outcry. People said, like, this is ridiculous. Have you even thought about the implications of this for women cyclists? Which I gather the answer to which was no, because now they've walked it back to some extent. And it feels as though the reaction tells you that there wasn't enough consultation before. So why not consult and then announce? I don't understand the process they follow. I know it's difficult sometimes for these big organizations to consult. And the problem is for them, and I'm sympathetic to this, is when you open it up for consultation and you invite people around a table. Let's say you work with the cyclist union, that one that Adam Hansen runs, and you get some representatives from the professional teams, for instance. You'll be accused of not canvassing widely enough, or someone else will say, I wasn't there, so therefore it's not legitimate. So I get it. You can never satisfy everyone, but they seem to not satisfy anyone.
No. I just reading about another tweak here from the 1st of January 2026. The maximum height of bicycle rims for mass start road events will be 65 mil, with anything deeper banned. The measure was announced last month as part of a wave of regulation updates, all with the goal of improving safety in professional cycling. So it's another, like, sort of, it seems meaningless tweak to me. Have a look at the road furniture. Do you remember that? I think it was the Vuelta, where they funneled all the riders through some ridiculously narrow gap between two houses, and then over a little bridge. And I was like, well, there's your problem.
Yeah, and remember the Tour de France, there was a stage where the sprinters came flying into a town at 70 km an hour, and then to make a fairly hard right turn, and it narrowed at the same time. One of the guys went down in that stage finish. So and when you read their road book, they've got stipulations around how a sprint stage finish needs to look, and they don't seem to adhere to their policies in the first place, but then they want to tinker with things like handlebar width and so on, for which I'm not convinced there's any real evidence that they cause crashes. I've seen actually, though, some cyclists saying, yes, the narrow handlebars make bike control and maneuverability compromised. So maybe there is a perception around this, and maybe they are canvassing these opinions and getting real data-driven insights, but it doesn't feel like it to me, and it's frustrating because I feel like they could actually answer some of these questions in an evidence back fairly easily. Someone on Discourse posted a link to Dan Bigham's presentation or analysis of gear ratios and how often cyclists are actually pedaling while they are in those soon to be potentially banned gear ratios, right? Did you see that analysis or that piece of work?
Yeah.
And
No, gear ratios leave me cold, like, to be honest. But
yeah, like, and I don't, if Dan Bigham can do that, then the UCI could do something similar, and they could at least reinforce the changes they make with some rational arguments and some evidence basis, but they don't seem to do it. And we've complained before, like, you have all these incidents and crashes, and people say they're going up. I don't even know if they are going up, and if they are, why? When do they happen? You know, like, no one seems to be trying to be systematic about this in any respect. So when stuff like this happens, you say, oh, well, you know, another day, another decision.
yeah, I was watching a video the other day, and somebody said, well, why don't they just have wider tires to increase, like, sort of rolling resistance? And there was some sort of reason behind it. And I thought, well, it's a good idea, but has anybody actually thought about it or tested it? It sounds like a good idea in practice, you know. It changes the aerodynamics, and but
Yeah,
there's so many things you could do. Why don't you just put weights on the bike and make them slower?
yeah, let's go downhill slightly faster potentially.
Okay, why don't you ban carbon rebreathing? Oh, wait, they have.
But
That's
also in a reactionary way, right? So it's actually consistent with how many of these decisions seem to be made in reaction to something. And in this instance, it was reaction to journalists.
Well, the UCI put pressure on WADA, I think, because just to clarify that, WADA have added the non-diagnostic use of carbon monoxide to its prohibited methods list from next year, following concerns over its misuse. And you remember, I think this came out in the Tour in 2024, the Tour de
Yeah, just
France,
before, yeah.
via the Escape Collective, that riders had been using carbon monoxide rebreathing techniques, possibly to enhance performance, though it's still allowed to be used for testing. What was the reason for using it for testing? It was something about hemoglobin
Yeah, it's the
mass?
most accurate way to and reliable way to test that you're adapting to altitude, because your altitude exposure is meant to increase your hemoglobin mass, but you can't just measure hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit like you would on a basic blood test, because you get like a plasma volume expansion at altitude. So the carbon monoxide rebreathing is the accurate way to do that. And that's why teams were doing it. They even confessed, yes, we do it and we use it for measurement purposes. But the line between doing it when required to measure and doing it excessively to advance performance adaptation is a fine one.
Hmm. How the hell they're going to enforce this, I have no idea.
I know,
It's
it's almost like symbolic to say it's banned.
yeah.
Hmm.
So that's the crazy world of cycling in a nutshell. We've got a couple of classics and that coming up, and then it's cyclocross season.
Yes, looking forward to that actually. I hope Van Aert races a bit more. He hasn't had an injury like he did last year. And I don't know what Pidcock's plans are now that he's a Grand Tour rider.
Mm. I'm
But I hope that we see them all on the cyclocross. European champs is this weekend, by the way. So you've got Pogacar, Evenepoel, and Vingegaard, and Mads Pedersen. In
what's
fact,
the course like?
the time trial would have happened by the time people listen to this. So,
What's the course like for the road
uh,
race? Any idea?
yeah, it's got 3 7K climbs at 7% in the first half. And then they top that last big climb with 70 odd to go to the finish line, so 202K race. And then there are 4 little punches of 1.6K at 9.7% in the last 50Ks. So it's pretty good. Like it's well set up for a 100K attack by Pogacar.
I was going to say it's long enough. Well, the climbs are steep enough for him to drop everybody. Then I guess.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. And even the time trials, Evenepoel will try and win the time trial. And again, this you'll hear this when you know that result. So
Yeah,
let me not make ourselves sound foolish talking in the past.
indeed. Talking about knowing the result and thinking you know the result, and then having major doubts.
Superb
Ryder Cup on
segue.
the weekend.
Great segue.
Ryder Cup on the weekend.
Yeah.
What a superb piece of sporting drama it turned out to be, although it didn't look like that way for a long time. I'm gonna get straight into it because from the very first tee, I messaged you and said, I'm not sure I can stick the American crowds for the duration of this event. And I thought that they were going to be respectful. And I even posted that on Discourse because I wrote a little about the Ryder Cup in my newsletter. They did not turn out to be respectful in any way whatsoever. And Tom Watson has come out and said
Mm.
he's ashamed of the American crowds. And the PGA did nothing about it. What were your thoughts on, and then we'll get it out of the way. What were your thoughts on the crowd?
Well, predictably boorish and uncouth and disgraceful.
Yeah.
I don't know how
Kevin
you
said that
play
on
like that. I
discourse.
mean, I suppose if you say as a player, I'm not. And there were moments where McElroy says, I won't putt until they're quiet, you know? But the players could go further and they could say, I'm not playing unless this is dealt with. And you could see there were times Lowry and McElroy were gesturing to have certain spectators kicked out. But you start looking petulant when you do that. So the player has no recourse. They just have to deal with it or try and block it out or channel it, as I think some of them did fairly successfully, to play better, to shut them up with what you do on course. But I mean, it's not the first time, right? Part of the appeal of the Ryder Cup is the home ground support and the fans and the fact that it is a hostile environment. But there's a line at which hostile becomes just not acceptable, and it was clearly crossed from the very beginning here.
Mhm. So the story was, and I think it sort of weaves into that crowd participation, we'll call it. For the first 2 days, Europe were totally dominant when it was in a sort of a team format. And I think the players, with the support of the other player and the caddies, felt that they were in a better position to actually counter the crowd and actually, as you say, use it a little bit as fuel as well, because you've got a teammate with you. You can really motivate yourself with it. And so Europe really dominated then when it was a team. But then on the final day, we assumed that it was all done and dusted. What was the score going into the final day? 12-5?
Yeah. That was, I think it was 11. Was it not 11.5, 4.5, and then they split.
Oh, yeah.
They split Hovland's point because he couldn't play, which is also weird.
That's right. And then,
because 16 points before the final day, so it would have been 11.5, 4.5, I think.
and then even in the singles, Europe started out, tremendously fast, and the scoreboard all looked blue and everything was happy. And then I messaged you and I said, there's a bit of a turnaround coming here because the American momentum started to grow. And I think that's when the singles aspect, the individuals on the American team sort of came into their own. And that's where I think the crowd started to really play into a factor.
Yeah, I think so, and maybe fatigue, like emotional fatigue from Europe, because the situations they would have found themselves in must have been wearing them down over the course of 2 days. And it was interesting that none of the European stars from days 1 and 2 won their games. In fact, very few of them even won half a point in the singles. And I think that might just be because for some of them it's their 4th round in 3 days. For 1 or 2 it was 5, right? I think at some point you just get worn down and you can't produce the little bits that you could do in the first part. So all of a sudden, and I think this is the beauty of the Ryder Cup. I remember a guest of ours on the pod a couple of years back, Omar Chaudhry, who's a sports analyst, said that the scoring system in the Ryder Cup is the best in any sport because it keeps jeopardy alive even when it's very one-sided. And I think we saw that happen here because there's 28 points to be won and you've got to get to 14 if you're the defending champ, 14 and a half if you're not. And there's 12 of those points available on the last day. So even when it's really one-sided, you still want to see how it's going to develop. And because those 12 points are not coming from one situation, but from 12 unique situations, as in 12 different matches, it's literally possible that you could go 9-3 because they're all independent events in a way. They're connected but independent events. And so, imagine if it was 9-7 after. It would be absolutely riveting watching on the Sunday. It's really one of the best sports events to watch, even if you're not into golf. And I think the way it played out on Sunday was the perfect example of how the scoring system just keeps it alive for so long. It was honestly, like I think I said on Discourse, it was probably the best sport I've watched in easily this year, if not in a couple of years.
I almost gave up on it. I almost gave up and said, right, this is a walkover now. I'll go and watch something else instead. I think the NFL was on at the time. And then the thoughts just started to creep in. Hang on, what if?
Yeah,
What if?
exactly.
And I think those thoughts were creeping into the players' heads.
Yeah,
And they were
for sure.
magnifying the performance of the Americans and diminishing the Europeans. And like you say, it's the format that keeps you interested to the end. If it had been another day of fourballs, it wouldn't have been half as interesting as
Agreed. And you know what's interesting is a few things could be happening. Like you mentioned, the Europeans do well in the foursomes and the fourballs. For those who don't know, fourballs is 2 from each team, Europe, 2 from United States, play together and best score counts per hole. Foursomes, they alternate shots. So the foursomes is particularly interesting to me because you have to basically play what your teammate gives you. And I would imagine that lends itself to a collaborative mindset rather than an individualistic one. Because if you're Scotty Scheffler, you're getting shots that you're not accustomed to because someone else has hit them for you before you play yours. So the psychology of the foursomes and the fourballs is quite interesting. I'd love to get really candid insights from players who would say to you, for instance, like, I hate the foursomes because I just don't want someone else playing my approach shot for me. I don't trust them. Imagine they'd say that. And then the other interesting thing I was wondering is on the final day, when your lead is as big as that, I wonder if there's a mindset of like being more conservative. All we got to do is not lose. Because if four of us can halve our matches or tie our matches, however you want to put it, we win. So 4 out of 12 needed to tie, and they were looking like they weren't going to achieve that. So I wonder if there was a shift away from being aggressive towards being more conservative that changed the way that they approached it.
Yeah, because of course the Americans have got nothing to lose.
So
it
you
doesn't
have to
make any
go
difference
for
to
it.
them. So you can attack.
And one of the most interesting things...
The foursomes, you said.
Yes, sorry, we broke up there.
Interesting about the foursomes, because obviously team selection is vitally important. But that goes back way, way before. You don't just wake up in the morning and say, oh, you're going to play with you, you're going to play with you. And I think the Europeans had a bit of a strategy behind that you found out about, didn't you?
Yeah, so I wanted to play this clip for you, actually. Let me see if I can tee it up, and then you'll hear it. So what you're going to be listening to here is Eduardo Molinari talking on a podcast, the link of which will be in the show notes. But I did just want to mention it because it's a really interesting and I think quite a good podcast on golf analysis and analytics. And it's called No Laying Up. The Twitter handle is straight up no laying up, no spaces. And there's a link to this particular podcast in the show notes. But the next voice you'll hear will be Molinari talking about how they make their selections based on data analytics, which is something you also brought up earlier. So here's Molinari talking about that.
In foursomes, it's a bit more complex. So I started to kind of develop a system where basically we could have, let's say, Rory playing with Tommy, and then Rory will hit the tee shot on the first. We know exactly how many times he's going to hit the fairway and how far it's going to be. So then from there, Tommy's going to hit the second shot, and we know his like dispersion and strokes gained from each distance range. How many times does he hit it inside 10 feet? And then Rory hits the putt, and then you just keep going. They basically you make them play 18 holes on a kind of a simulation, and then you get an expected score, and then you flip them. So all of a sudden, Tommy hits the first, and Rory hits the second shot at the first. And then you do the same for all possible combinations. And we could do it. I mean, we were looking at like 25, 30 players. And you know, all of a sudden you had some players that were very good in foursomes for different reasons. Like one player could be very good because he hits a lot of fairways. One player could be very good because on, I don't know, even holes, it's important to putt very well. So like he could be a great foursome player. For example, Ludwig was great because he's obviously unbelievable off the tee. And then if he was playing even, you could hide a little bit his weakness which is his approach play.
Yeah, so I thought it was fascinating to hear, and I'm sure that's the tip of the iceberg, actually.
But the analytics going on in the background, and perhaps that's an advantage that Europe took into it if the Americans perhaps weren't doing that background in advance. So,
and this is where I find it inconceivable that the US wouldn't try and use data analytics in similar ways to this. Maybe not running hundreds of simulations the way that Molinari talks about there. I don't know, but it seems to me almost impossible that both teams wouldn't use it. Be interested to know.
It would be interesting, but let's just hypothesize that the Americans weren't using it. What a huge advantage that would be to have your pairings right beforehand and giving them every opportunity. Like you said, the one player who isn't as strong off the tee. And so you could sort of work around that. It's fascinating. I never even thought about it.
Yeah, I wondered how you make those picks. And obviously you need some chemistry between your players. You need McIlroy and Fleetwood, they called it Fleetwood Mac, Tommy Fleetwood, to have good chemistry and to play well with one another. But the technical integration, or what's the word for, like compatibility, dovetailing, thank you, is obviously really important. And I don't know, the one thing I do wonder about that though is, barring, it was nearly disaster for the Europeans on Sunday. But imagine that hadn't happened, that Lowry misses that putt, and then one of those other games is won by the US and you end up losing. Then we wouldn't be having this conversation about the European advantage, right? And I often wonder about these margins and how we retrofit our theories for what happened after the fact.
Yeah, you could say that, but then again, it's the advantage was still there. Even if they'd lost in the end
That's
because of the singles, then
no,
that groundwork would
that
still have been done, and it still would have been relevant.
that's
And
true.
that's
Yeah,
what put them in the position to do it. You can't.
on the assumption that the US didn't have similar. There was some, not controversy, but there was some raised eyebrows at some of the pairings that the US announced. It's hard to imagine that they haven't made those selections and pairings without some data. But then
Well,
in
they
that
will
case,
now.
it's not good data. And
Yeah,
that's the point, right? Is everyone has access to data, but the trick is who can use it best.
indeed.
And I mean, it's also the other thing about this last word on that is, if your assumption, for instance, is that Ludwig's really good off the tee but not on the approaches, then he's only going to hit, I don't know, 7 tee shots in a round of foursomes. So
Mhm.
if
Is
his
it?
normal stat is 6 out of 7 and he misses 2 and he's now 4 out of 7, then your pick looks really bad because he's off by 2 and 7. Like and the margins are so small that I sometimes wonder about these stats. The one I often think about is if you're coaching tennis, let's say, and you've got a player who's playing in the Wimbledon finals against Alcaraz, and it's fourth set, 4-3, and Alcaraz is serving breakpoint down. Where's he going to hit the serve? And you can use all the data analytics in the world, and the data will tell you that 75% of the time he's going to go wide, and 20% of the time he's going to go down the middle, and 5% into the body. Do you want the player to know that at those percentages, or would you rather he think about it and figure it out on the court?
Mhm.
Because at what point is the confidence level high enough that you'd want him to know it and not think anymore? That's what I
Yeah.
often wonder about data.
I'm a great believer in intuition. And that's, I
Yeah,
think, what makes great players great.
yeah. So I would rather not have my player go in their mind, I know this is a 3/4 likelihood it's going to go wide, but there's still a quarter he's going to down the middle. So can I rather intuit what he's going to do rather than trust on some? I don't know. It's a dilemma I've often wondered.
Okay, we'll move on to the last thing I watched on Sunday night, which was the NFL, um, because it's as my headline is ACL Arama, because we've had a spate of ACL injuries in sport recently. The week before, Nick Bosa of the 49ers did his ACL. He's out for the season. On Sunday, Malik Neighbors of the Giants did his ACL. He's out for the season. And then Monday night, Tyreek Hill of the Dolphins. He did his ACL and he's out for the season. And in
Mm.
soccer, Giovanni Leone of the Liverpool player, he did his ACL and he's out for a year as well. What's going on with all the ACL injuries? Is it just one of those periods where we're just seeing just a spate of them for no reason? It's just sort of recency bias. Because I was looking into, and we've talked about it before, the field surfaces where they're played on
Mm.
artificial turf or grass makes a difference. And I've been looking at statistics, and there seems to be a slight increase on artificial turf, but nothing major. Is it just a case of recency bias, or are we seeing more powerful athletes whose bodies can't take the strain when they cut and turn, or what?
Yeah, I honestly I don't know. It's one where you have to ask for the stats before you make a decision, and unfortunately, you need the stats over a fairly long period because ACL injuries are rare. I know that when we've just introduced this segment with 3 or 4 of them in the last 2 weeks, they don't feel rare, but they actually are, and it's a big dilemma when you're dealing with like a fairly rare event. You can often be misled by coincidental. Wasn't it Taleb who spoke about how we see patterns too regularly and fooled by randomness? I think was the book that dealt with this issue specifically. It was interesting. When I was in London a couple of weeks back for that conference, there was a session on women's player welfare issues in rugby, and they'd actually invited a woman by the name of Dr. Frankie Phantom Brown, who's now the head of research and strategy for women's football at FIFPro, which is that player union at FIFA. And someone in the audience asked her about ACL injuries in women's footballers, and she was unequivocal. She said it's not higher than it is in men. The only reason we think it's higher is because the media gives them more attention when they happen, and it creates in people a perception that they're more common than they actually are. And I was quite surprised by that because I thought that the data suggested that they are slightly higher, and she pretty much said, no, that's not the case, and that there hasn't been an increase. And so I always wonder when you bring up examples like these, whether that's the same thing that we're seeing. But then every one of them, it feels to me like in the NFL, every one of them would get covered.
Mm. Yeah, and the big name players.
Yeah, so disproportionately covered when it's a Tyreek Hill or a Bosa. But they're not. It's not like they're happening and we're not aware of them, like would be the case for, let's say, women's football, even men's football. If 3 players got an ACL injury in Turkey, Germany, and Norway's Premier divisions this weekend, I wouldn't hear about it. But if it was happening in a Champions League match to Kylian Mbappe, then it's going to be news. So I do wonder about that, and that's why you need this systematic injury surveillance to try and uncover that. But I do know that in the NFL, their 2 main research and injury management priorities are obviously concussion, but lower extremity injuries have become equal in prioritization with that. And I think it's because they've seen not just ACL, but a lot of ankle injuries and other low extremity injuries that tend to be quite costly, right? Because that's Tyreek Hill's done. I mean, those 3 players are done. That's their season gone, and they're big names. So if it's a focus for the NFL, it means that it's an issue that they've recognized. So I'm leaning towards maybe in answer to your question.
There goes me seeing patterns where there might not be patterns again.
That's human nature.
How about patterns in doping? Because we're seeing a lot of doping lately.
Yeah.
Did you see that Erriyon Knighton?
Yeah, so that
lost his appeal at CAS.
Yeah, that happened when? During World Champs, just before World Champs in Tokyo. So we kind of didn't cover it, mention it. Mm-hmm. But Knighton, sorry, go on.
So I was just going to give you the background. He tested positive in March 2024 for trenbolone, but it was his appeal that was heard. I think it was around the 13th of September, and was sort of dismissed by CAS for a number of reasons. Basically, that he can't possibly have eaten an amount of meat that would have given him that sort of concentration of trenbolone.
Yeah, exactly. So the backstory to this is that he tests positive, as you said, in mid-March 2024. The initial appeal, remember, is made to the US Anti-Doping Agency, and they cleared him. Mm-hmm. So the CAS case, he's actually the respondent, and WADA and World Athletics are the appellants. And so they've gone to CAS to appeal the fact that he was cleared. So that's an additional layer of intrigue. And when you talk about patterns, one of the problems in anti-doping is there is no pattern. Because the case eventually comes down to contaminated meat. That's the defense that he puts forward when he goes to USADA and gets cleared. So they believe him because he's able to show that the bakery that he went to, he had oxtail, he bought oxtail from them, and he's able to show that that particular bakery uses meat that is sourced from a place that uses trenbolone. And so they clear him in the initial decision. And at CAS, they make the opposite conclusion, or they reach the opposite conclusion rather. And I just wanted to read to you, WADA's case basically is that the athlete fails to present evidence that the meat contamination scenario is probable. Not that it hasn't happened, but just that it can't explain his sample or his adverse analytical finding. And the reasons are numerous, and I'll put the link to this decision in the show notes. It came out relatively recently. But basically, Knighton's urine concentration was 1.3 nanograms per milliliter. And when they tested the meat from the bakery, they found a concentration of 0.1 nanograms per gram of meat in the 500 grams that he ate. And pharmacokinetically, so in other words, this involves some pretty hefty pharmacokinetic analysis. The argument that WADA makes is that it's impossible, inconceivable, that by eating that amount of meat contaminated with that amount of trenbolone, that he would produce a urine sample of 1.3 nanograms per mil. So in the end, the numbers don't add up to support him. And they end up arguing at this case that the concentration detected in the athlete's urine sample exceeds the dose consumed by a factor of 4.5. Even if, and I'm reading this point 60 in this decision, even if the athlete had consumed twice the amount of oxtail as alleged, which would be a kilogram's worth of meat, it would be an enormous portion for one person alone. And further assuming the concentration was 1 instead of 1.3, the meat contamination scenario would still be impossible because the concentration in the urine sample would still exceed the concentration present in the beef. So in the end, that's their case, and that case wins. Because when you then read the actual outcome of the decision, I wanted to just jump ahead to point 115. I know reading legal things is probably putting you all to sleep here, but I think it's an important one. It basically says The panel finds that some of the assumptions made by the experts appointed by the athlete appear as highly unlikely. And the main issue is that the concentration in the meat just cannot explain the concentration in the urine. And so they end up concluding that even though oxtail contamination brought by the athlete is possible, the panel finds that one of the main premises of this hypothesized scenario, namely that the ingested oxtail contained enough trenbolone residues to have caused the adverse finding, does not, in the light of factual evidence, seem plausible and certainly not more likely than not. And so because of that, he ends up getting 4 years.
Which puts him out of the LA Games in 2028. And obviously he's a big name. He's only 21 years old.
Yeah, he was the next big thing. He and Lyles were going to have the big rivalry in the 200, and now he's obviously gone from that, and the event has moved on without him. But it's an interesting one because, like, athletes should, I think, be held to account for supplements that they use. Because if you take a supplement and you're not absolutely positive that it's clean, then no fault applies. And then even if you're not intentionally doping, you're negligent and you've gained this advantage through doping. The argument around eating food from a commercial outlet is a bit more difficult, right? So imagine it is the case that an athlete goes to a place, eats some meat, and that meat is contaminated. They don't have any way to prove it. His case is unusual because he's able to go back to source and find meat that contains the banned substance. It's almost unheard of that happens. There must have been... So one of two things has happened here. Either it's a very, very unfortunate coincidence. He's doping with trenbolone and he happens to eat meat contaminated with it at the same time.
Or he went looking for somewhere with
exactly
trenbolone contaminated meat.
Or the third option is that he's never doped and he's eaten this meat and there's something dodgy in the pharmacokinetic analysis that's eventually put him away. And if it's that third option, then how sympathetic you have to feel to athletes, because what do they do in that situation?
It's difficult, and that's what we keep saying, isn't it?
It's really
micro amounts.
It's really difficult, but you can see why the pharmacokinetics becomes decisive. And I mean, I remember the one funny, I think I've told this example before. A guy contacted me, not an elite athlete by any means, one of the age group guys. He said he'd failed a test for a steroid hormone. And I said, look, I'm not able to really get involved, but what you need to probably do is send that supplement away, get it tested, and maybe you'll find that it contains the steroid, the supplement that you think had it. So he does that. He sends this powder away to a lab. And sure enough, it comes back with traces of the supplement, of the steroid hormone. I nearly fell. If I hadn't been sitting in a chair, I would have fallen over. I was stunned. I was like, what are the chances? So then he appeals his case, and he fails on the basis of the pharmacokinetics as well, because the amount of steroid in his supplement was so tiny. It was like 1,000th of what ended up being detected in his urine. And he ended up getting an increased ban as a consequence of what was deemed to be a frivolous and unnecessary appeal because of the pharmacokinetics of it. And that's the same thing that's done for Knighton. So we trust the pharmacokinetic analysis. But it's a really difficult dilemma for me, the food contamination one.
Right, okay. So we'll go to another quick doping case, from sort of a grey area we don't know case to an open and shut case. Because Kibet Kiplagat, he's from Kenya, he's got a 5-year ban for EPO. And this is an odd one, because in an interview with the AIU, he said he'd overheard some other runners saying that EPO and sera would reduce lactic acid in the muscles, and so he decided he wanted to try these substances without knowing they were prohibited. So in July 2025, the athlete approached a bus conductor and gave him 5,000 Kenyan shillings to travel into Eldoret town and purchase the EPO and sera from any pharmacy or chemist. The bus conductor dropped off the EPO and sera he purchased for the athlete at a roadside vendor, where the athlete collected them. He did not know the bus conductor or the pharmacy he visited to buy EPO and sera. The athlete was not given any receipt of purchase. That's a pretty open and shut case, really.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's even if he's telling the truth about not knowing it was banned and that it would reduce lactate, thinking it was a natural supplement, it still doesn't matter. You know, it's a pretty easy one, that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got the dog ate my homework excuse, but the unidentified bus conductor went and picked up my EPO for me, and I didn't know it was. Yeah.
But I mean, is it? can you actually, as a bus conductor in Kenya, walk into a pharmacy and come out with EPO?
Apparently you can. I don't know.
So,
That's
like when I
if
hear
you can,
that,
that's terrifying.
yeah, when I hear that, and then I think about the hundreds plus cases in Kenya, where
If it's that easy to
basically
buy.
we never ever hear about how these athletes got hold of those drugs, and now you hear that actually you can ask some stranger to go and pick it up for you and drop it off.
If he thought it was legal, why did he send a bus conductor?
Well, maybe I don't know. Like maybe he just doesn't have another way to go there. He couldn't afford the fare.
Okay.
But then who's paying for the EPO? So that doesn't work. But it's
Thanks to Jonathan Galt on Twitter. Give credit to that one.
yeah. He posted some of those excerpts from that decision. I'll see if I can find it and put in the show notes. You can read the full the full act. But the case is different just for the fact that we hear so many Kenyan cases and we never discover how they got the drugs, and now we do in this one. And I'm not sure it's plausible, but nevertheless, it's an interesting one. Why is it so difficult to find out where the other 100+ athletes got theirs?
Over the counter, apparently.
Yeah, but who's providing it? Like, and is it possible? I think it is possible that an athlete wouldn't know EPO was banned, because if you're not taught that, how would you know it?
Maybe.
But anyway, it doesn't matter. It's moot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and finally, you got an and finally. It's your turn this week.
Yeah, I don't watch much in the way of American football, but I happened to have the game in Dublin on at the weekend. They were playing in Croke Park. I don't know if you saw that. It was the Steelers against. Don't tell me.
Vikings.
Damn it! I was going to say Vikings. Yeah, and at one point they cut away to the crowd shot, and they show the NFL commissioner Roger Goodell sitting amongst a group of Irish rugby players. Bundy Aki's on his right-hand side, and Caelan Doris, thank you, is on his left-hand side. And then the commentary talks about rugby, and it kicked off on social media, the usual who's harder, the rugby players or the NFL. But I wanted to play you this soundbite of the NFL commentators talking about this, and then we'll share a couple of insights on it. Here they are speaking now.
Commissioner Goodell sitting with some Irish rugby players. By the way, walking through Trinity College yesterday, I just happened upon a rugby game. My jaw dropped watching these dudes pummel each other. No helmets, no pads.
Why don't you tell everybody what they told you they refer to American football as?
I don't think I can use that word. But yeah, they said it. I was like, okay, yeah, fair.
Yeah, okay,
watching
fair.
you guys do what you do.
Yes, sir.
This doesn't feel quite as tough.
Yeah, we'll that'll be after dark.
Yeah. Tune into our podcast later. Roger.
So, the first mystery is, what did the players refer to the NFL as?
I'm not repeating on this podcast either, but I can guess.
Send your best guesses into Discourse, folks, in response to this podcast when it goes out. The second issue, I just think it's interesting. Aside from the childishness around arguments on social media about who's tougher and which sport is more dangerous, the interesting question is the perception around rugby from American football people, where there's no pads, is polar opposite to our perception of American football, where there are pads, because I think the pads make the sport more dangerous and the helmets make it more risky, because you can do things that you wouldn't be able to do without them. And the NFL is a collision sport, whereas I would like to think rugby is a contact sport. Now, that's not always the case, but I think that if rugby introduced pads and helmets, the risk would go up.
Yeah. I think helmets and pads in the NFL are more of a marketing gimmick than a safety thing. It's to make the players look cool.
So that's an interesting one, because I mentioned a few minutes ago that in the NFL, the concussion prevention is top of their welfare list, along with low extremity injuries. For the last decade, their central piece in concussion management has been helmets, and they've worked with a number of engineering companies and researchers, some of whom we're working with now on the mouthguard stuff, to try and develop and assess helmet safety. And they created, a few years back, they created a list of approved helmets. Then they rated them like you would see light bulb efficiency, A+, A, B+, and so on. And players are only allowed to wear helmets that are on that list and score highly. And their concussion rates have come down. So they are quite convinced that the helmets do reduce the concussion risk. I've not seen papers describing that. And concussion is tricky because they've also changed a number of other things, like the tackle, the spear, what they call what is it called in the NFL when you spear someone directly with the top of the helmet on the crown? Targeting or something.
Targeting, I think.
Yeah. Plus, they've changed their kickoff rules a few times in the last 5 or 6 years, having recognized that was a really high concussion risk play. So they've done a lot of, I think, really good things, and in amongst that are the helmets, and it's quite difficult to tease apart whether the helmets are making a difference or not. But they genuinely do believe that the helmets are protective against concussion because of the way they're designed now compared to, say, 10 years ago when I think they had no effect.
But having a helmet on encourages you to stick your head where you shouldn't be sticking your head. And we talked about that with the headbands in rugby.
Yes. And
it's a false sense of security.
Yes.
That actually causes more problems.
Yeah, and it's known as colloquially as the Superman effect. There's a more academic epidemiological term which is called risk compensation effect. And we've actually just had a paper accepted. It's not published yet. I'll be sure to mention it when it is. Looking at headgear use, the soft shells helmets in rugby union, and per 1,000 tackles and per 1,000 hours, players in headgear are more likely to leave the field with head injuries than players without. Now, that could be confounded by the position they play in. We used as many cases as we could, but the sample size probably isn't where it needs to be. But it does confirm what you've just said. So I think it's I think it's an interesting debate, but it's just interesting to hear the American perception of rugby as harder, whereas the NFL, the nature of the game, I think there are more very high-speed, non-binding collisions, which probably create higher forces. And the end result of all this, by the way, is that the concussion risk is probably about the same, just for interest's sake. In the NFL in 2024, there were 5.7 concussions every 10 matches. In global club rugby, it's at around 6 per 10 matches. The difference is ball and play. Like a rugby match exposes 30 players for 80 minutes each, An NFL game, the exposure is not nearly as high because you got some players who come on to be kickers and place holders.
But the plays are more explosive.
Yeah, whereas the plays that do happen for the players who are involved more regularly are more explosive. So in the end, they end up looking pretty similar in terms of risk profiles and numbers, but they get there via, I think, quite different mechanisms. So I thought it was an interesting
There we go.
Point out. Yeah.
Good one to end on. I'll do next week's.
Good stuff. Yeah, yours will be funnier. Mine are more academic. Send us what you think the Irish players.
Stick it in YouTube comments because we're on YouTube.
Yeah, we're on YouTube now, which if you've watched this for the last hour and 12 minutes. For those of you who haven't, but you've listened, you've not missed a thing, we say once again, thanks for listening. Thanks for being Discourse members, those of you who are, and those of you who are not, you know exactly what to do. We will be back next week with another Spotlight. For now, goodbye.